So yesterday, President Joe Biden went down to Charleston, South Carolina to give a political speech at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. That is where, of course, Dylann Roof massacred so many people in a horrific incident. While Biden was speaking, he was interrupted by protesters demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Let's take a listen.
Without the truth, there's no light. Without light, there's no path from this darkness.
If you really care about the lives lost here, then you should honor the lives lost and call for a ceasefire in Palestine.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. I understand their passion, and I've been quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza. I'm using all that I can to do that.
So that is the way that unfolded. From my perspective, when you have protesters who are demanding an end to the mass murder of children and other innocents, and the response is 4 more years, it is a very dark situation. I mean, listen, I would love, Saagar, for Joe Biden in particular, but for all politicians who are enabling this, to have to face these types of protests and face the horrors of what they're enabling. I would love for them to have to deal with that every single day. And, the Biden campaign and the Biden administration, their theory of the case of why, young people, they'll get over it, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, they'll get over it. When they remember that it's Donald Trump on the ballot, they'll show back up, they'll come back around. And they think that this will be in the, quote, rearview mirror. And I think actions like this, which have persisted for months at this point, are a very clear demonstration that, no, they're not getting over it. And there is no going back to a time before this was all enabled by Joe Biden.
Yeah, I was interested to play this. And actually, maybe if you don't mind, could you set up the next element? Because I think this is going to be an instructive conversation about protest, about its place in American life, usefulness, counterproductivity, and all of that.
Yes. So there were also yesterday mass protests in New York City. We can go ahead and put this up on the screen, where pro-ceasefire protesters shut down 3 different bridges. You can see this is the Brooklyn Bridge. They also shut down the Holland Tunnel. That's what you're looking at here. And here we have Manhattan Bridge, and I think we had one more bridge. And this is an individual who is upset because he is being delayed. I would probably be upset too. And he's yelling at the protesters, getting out of his car, shoving them, becoming irate. So this was the scene that unfolded in New York yesterday. And here you have police who are sawing through, I believe, the chains that they had chained themselves together. And a number of people were arrested in these protests, which shut down traffic for, I believe, roughly hour and a half, 2 hours yesterday in New York City. Yeah,
so the reason I think this is a good juxtaposition for me personally, and I know you disagree, is that I have 0 issues with the protest to the President of the United States. But these protests drive me absolutely crazy. And not only are they counterproductive, but I went back and I did a lot of reading. And my favorite book on this subject about the new left and the rise of this type of protest and belief was, it's called Days of Rage. And what it is that if you actually see the way that the rhetoric that was these organized things where they call them actions. Action is a traditional word in New Left activism, and it goes back to the days of the Weather Underground, of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and many of these other crackpot groups from back in that time. And those people had a fundamental belief that if you set off, 1,000 bombs or whatever, what the Weather Underground and these types of groups did, if you kidnap Patty Hearst, if you, create awareness, quote unquote, and you basically make life miserable and annoying for people, that they will rise up the great proletariat against the establishment. And instead, actually, it was completely counterproductive. The vast majority of people hated these groups. They supported law enforcement, and they turned against the very causes which the protest movements of the 1960s on civil rights and on Vietnam were extraordinarily successful. So what I would say to these Palestinian groups is that blocking working class people from traffic, or a man from from his daughter, preventing people from picking or dropping off from school or for going to work is not only counterproductive, but is fundamentally stupid, and it misses the point of who is actually in power for quote unquote awareness. So for example, remember the debate about the lady who followed Kirsten Sinema into the bathroom and yelled at her, and everyone was like, oh, this is an outrageous breach. And I was like, hey, sorry, eat shit. You're a politician. It is what it is. I'm not saying it's pleasant. You can resign. Go for it. I don't care. But at the end of the day, I believe in maximalist protest against people who are in power. But blocking normal folks from traffic, just as many of these climate folks have done, also the people who throw, blood or whatever on these Van Gogh paintings and all that, this is just classic new left activism. And folks, you're going to lose, just like the Black Panthers did, just like the Weather Underground, just like these other. So if you believe in making an impact, this is just the wrong thing to do. And I think you should be arrested. I don't think you should be doing or allowed to be doing such like this. It just doesn't work, and it misses the point about the center of gravity for Israel is not in the American populace. The American populace supports a ceasefire. It is in Joe Biden, the United States Senate, and the DC establishment. So go outside the White House and protest all day long. And in fact, go back and read the hey, hey, LBJ chants. They drove him nuts, and they arguably did have an impact on Vietnam policy. But blocking a Brooklyn man from going to see his daughter, I don't know, man. That's just so wrong to me.
So I disagree on basically every level.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So they've been protesting outside the White House every day. Do you know what impact it's had? Nothing.
Well,
absolutely
Vietnam took 5 years,
nothing.
But it has still happened.
So to conflate this completely nonviolent protest with the Weather Underground, 100% nonviolent protest here. Blocking traffic, blocking bridges, blocking tunnels. To conflate that with the Weather Underground, that is just wildly wrong and inappropriate.
I'm talking about the theory.
So let me talk about the theory here. So first of all, number one, do I think that the cause of attempting to stop babies from being bombed and an entire population from being starved is important, vital, and urgent enough to inconvenience people, to justify inconveniencing people? That's the first test. That's the first thing you object to. Yes, I do. I think it justifies inconveniencing people because of the vast scale, unprecedented nature of the horrors that are being inflicted. That's number one. Number two, the question, is it effective? Listen, we can't really know in real time, but protests, like mass protests like this, come out of the media era, where the goal isn't, to persuade that gentleman in the car who's very irate, or even, the people immediately there in New York. The goal is to get media attention to draw eyeballs to your cause. Did they accomplish that? Yes, 100%. Have we covered any of the protests outside the White House? No.
No, that's not true.
Are we covering now the protests that interrupted Joe Biden and these protests, which I think were very creative, in fact, which disrupted life in New York City? Yes. So does it pass the test of it garners eyeballs? Yes. Second piece of, what makes a protest effective, does it win people over to your cause? And I'm not talking about overall majority opinion, although that can happen too. And usually when that happens is when there is a disproportionate response from police and other authorities that garners sympathy for the activists. They were arrested. I wouldn't call the response to be disproportionate or the sort of thing that would garner that sort of sympathy. But did it draw the sort of attention that could win more activists to their cause? Yes. Third question, to your point, already a majority of the American public agrees with, overwhelmingly, wants a ceasefire. The one person who is determinative on this is Joe Biden. It's all about Joe Biden, right? And what is Joe Biden telling himself right now? Because obviously he doesn't care about babies being killed in Gaza, it's pretty clear. Obviously he doesn't care about, the humanitarian situation. Apparently he doesn't care about the possibility of the US getting drawn into war, at least not enough to actually do something about it. What he might care about is his political prospects. They're telling themselves that this is going to be in the rearview mirror. And these protests, day after day, these mass actions day after day, are a clear message aimed directly at Joe Biden. No, it won't be. We are not going away. These disruptions are not going away. Life is not going to be normal again for you, certainly, until you stop the bombing in Gaza. So on those metrics of success, just as a tactic, I think it passes. And then the last thing, which is perhaps the most important to me, is, if I look back at nonviolent protesters against past horrors, slavery, right? The abolitionists, those who protested against like the Holocaust, those who were protesting Jim Crow, again, non-violently. I could not possibly, even if I thought the tactic was like a little foolish or not going to work or whatever, which again, I don't think that's the case here, but even if I did, could I find it in my heart to criticize the people who are on the right side of history, who are trying to do everything they can to try to force some sort of an end to the horrors that are being inflicted here? No, there's no way I could find it in my heart to do
So
that.
I totally understand where you're coming from, but the reason why I've compared it to that is about the theory of the case, which is about making life more miserable in a democracy. And I, you know what? I can hear the emotion in your voice, and I just think it's a fundamental disagreement. I mean, at the end of the day, the people who are dying here are not American citizens. Even in the case of Vietnam, like this was about American soldiers. But what I would disagree with is that you were saying, you know, we did cover a protest at the White House. We sent our own Mac over there in order to do the filming, but it took 5-10 years, you know, of protests against Vietnam. That's simply, you know, you don't get to have immediate gratification.
In 5 or 10
in American
years,
life.
there won't be a single Palestinian left in Gaza.
But,
I mean, that's the thing. It's so immediate. And our people are not dying yet. Actually, our soldiers came very close to being killed thanks to the this conflict and
very true.
Iraqi
You're right.
militias, you know, firing on them while they're sleeping in barracks. So the risk is incredibly real. These are our tax dollars that are paying for these 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that are being dropped on civilians in Gaza. So to be like, oh, this doesn't really concern, of course it does. And clearly these protesters feel that incredibly, incredibly deeply. And that's why they're doing whatever they can think of to do to try to disrupt this, try to put pressure on Joe Biden. Because listen, unfortunately, it's not about winning people over in a democracy. Because if that was the case, it'd be over already.
Yes, that's true.
It would be over already. This is not a democratic action. This is about pressuring Joe Biden and persuading him that this is not going away. This is not going to be in the rearview mirror. And so, yes, I do think that attention-grabbing actions like this could move the needle. Maybe. I mean, listen, there's no guarantees, but could move the needle here.
Let's reverse and look back. What was the result of 1968, of the mass protest movement? What ended up happening? A landslide election for Richard Nixon, who wanted to crack down on protests. The silent majority who despised and were angry at the hippies who had taken over the cities and were doing many of the same things here.
There are no pro-Palestinian politicians on the ballot.
My point,
so it's not like there's a better option out there.
That the vast majority of people, as we also saw post-BLM, turned against the BLM movement. You know, you could use the same justification for much of the looting and other things that accompanied
those
BLM riots.
You cannot compare nonviolent protests.
But even the
protests that in
nonviolent
some instance turned violent.
Yes,
like
no,
that is
absolutely.
not a fair comparison to make.
But let's look about the BLM riot. Okay, let's look at the BLM nonviolent marches themselves and about eventually what occurred, which was a mass social chilling against anybody, including people like me, who spoke out against what we thought was a ridiculous cause at the time. What ended up happening is that huge amounts of people felt as if they could not speak out then at the time and ended up supporting more pro-police policies. The net effect of BLM has had no impact on the overall cause.
I don't see
that
the analogy here because the people who feel they can't speak out right now are the people who are trying to defend Palestinians.
Well,
so
if you can block traffic,
it's
then you
completely
can speak
reversed.
out.
And again, I think what people responded to, because the original peaceful marches, I mean, you remember, it was overwhelmingly popular. You had huge constituencies, millions of people out in the street, et cetera, et cetera. I think what caused the backlash is the looting, is the violence that broke out in plenty of locations. There's no analogy here. There is no looting. There is no violence. This is a completely like textbook nonviolent civil action that is occurring here. And like I said, even if I thought it was like foolish, which again, I don't, there is no way that I could look at what's unfolding in Gaza and be like, where there are such clear villains and be like, oh, these people who are on the right side of history, they're the ones that I'm going to complain about. They're the ones that I'm going to criticize.
I just don't think much of this right side of history stuff ends up standing up because the truth is I mean, everybody thinks that whenever they're involved.
It's a genocide.
No, well,
Saagar,
first of all,
it is a genocide.
Well,
at the very least, it is a mass killing of civilians. If there is a right side of history that has ever been clear, which yes, you're right, in many instances it's a judgment call. I think it's pretty compelling which is the right side of history here, just based on the numbers of civilians who are being massacred and starved at the moment.
So I think that the mass killing, slaughter, and all that, here's the thing. I not only have condemned it, I've talked about it with you now for 2 months straight. I'm talking about we live in a democracy. actually not even inconveniencing. Who knows? What if you stopped an ambulance, as we saw during Bridgegate? I mean,
We'd know about it by now.
Maybe, but they certainly could have done it, and they were willing to take that risk. That's fine. You're allowed to do that as an American citizen. I think that as long as it's nonviolent, absolutely. And I don't think you should be treated badly in order that. We're talking about what is the overall net democratic effect. And I think it's incredibly counterproductive. And then generally, it goes back to that disagreement that we have here about new left tactics, where yes, it bled into violence in the case of the Weather Underground. But fundamentally, what it came from was that they believed they could no longer work within the corridors of power in order to pressure them. And they were wrong. I believe that they were absolutely wrong. And because of that, they ended up seeding, actually, and fusing much of the new left with the Democratic politicians, which allowed the overall Nixonian takeover. So what I would say to many of these people who are doing this is that turning the regular populace against you makes it so that the more politically popular choice for Eric Adams and for Joe Biden would be to crack down on these protesters. It would be to send the police in, beat the shit out of them.
And guess what would happen then? Guess what would happen then?
I actually don't know.
Public opinion would turn in favor of the protesters.
I don't think so,
you look at the civil rights movement. What caused the public to really turn and be on their side? It's when they unleashed dogs on the protesters, because they felt the same way. They're like, these people are annoying. They're taking over our cities. This rabble needs to go. If you have a protest that is inconveniencing no one, you know what it's going to do? Absolutely freaking nothing.
But you should inconvenience the right people, which are the people in power. You should go outside the White House and you should scream, which is what they should. Listen, that's what they did in Vietnam. And you can say that it didn't have an effect. I think it had a tremendous effect. The occupation of that ground about that White House. I think that those protests that were eventually, for example, at that time, college sit-ins did nothing. Screaming outside the White House had a massive impact on overall U.S. policy. Or, for example, when President Nixon showed up at the Lincoln Memorial in order to talk with the protesters there and to figure out, he's like, why can I cannot connect with those folks? That was occupation of a federal monument and a specific, protest against a policy. But the overall American populace dramatically rejected this, as we can see from the historical record. And I would disagree, because at the time, what shocked the Northern conscience is that they were already on the side of the civil rights protesters. Here, they had not seen the validation of that cause.
Well,
but Israel is a 50-50 split.
Not in terms of a ceasefire. Not in terms of a ceasefire. But again, Saagar, the idea that having a majority of people support a ceasefire is going to change anything is clearly not true. Like, that's clearly not true. So, in my opinion, the most effective thing is to try to create pressure that convinces Joe Biden that this is not going away. That's your best hope, because it really comes down to this one senile old man who is deluding himself into, justifying atrocities and is turned out to be a complete monster. That's your whole goal. And so, listen, are there guarantees that this action or any other action is going to influence this one senile old man? No. But anything that you're doing that is aimed at persuading him and his political coterie that this is not going away and that people feel really strongly about this, so strongly they're willing to shut down bridges in Manhattan and piss off a bunch of motorists.
Yeah, but that's costless to them. The cost is paid by the motorists. I mean, that's kind of my point.
And we just view this differently, because given the 10 kids every day are losing their legs in Gaza, right? Half of the population is starving to death. 90% doesn't have a meal a day. It has already been rendered uninhabitable. The level of destruction is beyond Dresden and some of the other, horrors of the past. Like, that's where we are. So when I put that up against inconveniencing motorists for a couple hours during rush hour, I'm sorry, but I think it justifies that inconvenience. But can't you see how
you could say that for anything? I mean, you could make that for literally for any cause that you sufficiently believe in. And so I'm not putting down. You could believe whatever you want. But I mean,
Saagar, that's called moral relativism.
But it is moral relativism.
No,
everybody
it's not.
January 6th people believe that they were saving democracy. That doesn't justify what they were doing. That's my point.
What they believe and the facts and the reality
what's not is a judgment call.
Civilian death is, these are two very different things. So yes, in a sense, everything is subjective, but in another sense, it's very clear what's unfolding here. And when you just stack up the number of innocent lives that are lost, to put that against inconveniencing people. Yes, I think it's justified. And like I said, there is no way that I can criticize these people who I admire, who I wish I was more like them, to have the courage to go out and do these sorts of things and try to affect change, try to, rescue the lives of people that they don't even know in the Gaza Strip.
But that's kind of my point, is that I actually think you're doing far more of a service to the cause sitting here and we're talking, having an intelligent conversation, and we're talking about the news, and you probably changed 10 times more minds than any of those people have. So I disagree with that actually completely. And I just think that justification is one that anybody could use for anything.
Yeah, but sometimes it will be right and sometimes it would not be.
But who decides that? Nobody decides that. I mean, look, I could give the exact counter case, which is that these people, the Israeli case on this is these people support Hamas. We're making sure that the safety of our...
And what I said is not a lie.
I mean, what they helped is they helped elect him. At the very least, they lived under their rule. I don't believe this, to be clear. I'm giving what they could say. So obviously, we need to make sure that we have a safe zone around our territory. We have the military capability to do so. They don't. History belongs to the victors. So be it. You guys
you're
did
just
the same
total
thing.
moral relativism. There is no right and wrong. You can't say a genocide is wrong. Ethnic cleansing is wrong. These are things that are worth inconveniencing people to protest over.
I think Israeli action is wrong. I'm saying, though, that you can make this case in any form, and that that's why baseline rules overall matter, and that you should make sure that you're trying to... Look, I just simply don't believe in doing things that aren't going to do anything. So, for example, that's why I think this is deeply counterproductive, blocking people in traffic. Same with the climate change thing. Do I think anthropogenic climate change is real? Yes. Do I think that, defacing Van Gogh paintings and all that is going to do anything about it? No. And that's why I believe in nuclear power, and that's why I talk about it.
I don't think that's productive either. This is different. This is a different action, and it's much more targeted and it's much more immediate. There is a very clear demand. There's a very clear individual who needs to be influenced, and so I just basically disagree on every level. I disagree that it's not effective. I disagree that it is wrong, morally wrong in any sort of sense. These people are morally righteous. To me, there has never been anything more clear. And number three, there are villains right now, very clear villains. One of them is a mile away from here in the White House. And to spend any time criticizing the people who are trying to avert atrocities,
I think that's fair, Krystal. But if you were, what if they crossed into the realm of violence? Then what?
Well, then that's a different story. But we're not talking about this. This is nonviolent.
But then we do have to draw.
This is nonviolent.
There are, realms within people operating.
All right.
So then we get to
within
talk about
nonviolent protests, will I criticize nonviolent protesters who are saying no to genocide now or any other time in the past? No, I will not criticize them.
I just think that when we talk about effectiveness and about power and about what actually matters and what moves the needle, I don't see this as moving that at all. I think the Biden one actually might. And in fact, if that continues, that's something that he's going to have to deal with.
You have to try lots of things. And again, contentious politics, they are contentious for a reason. If they're not upsetting anyone or irritating anyone or causing any friction, they go completely unnoticed and they're completely pointless.
You may be right, but then we can't complain then whenever causes that we don't support subject themselves to the same level of tactics. And that's more where, I see not only media treatment.
The anti-vax people who took over the city in Canada.
Right. It didn't really work, though, unfortunately for them. They got cleared out by the police. The Canadian populace largely turned against them. They had a massive police state crackdown. From what I can tell, Trudeau got himself reelected.
But again,
it's not like it did much.
I just don't agree with this moral relativism of who can even say what's right or wrong? And all causes could theoretically be just. It's okay, but there are some things that should be really clearly off the table, that we should be able to very clearly say, this is right and this is wrong. And to me, again, this is the most clear-cut instance I've perhaps ever seen in my life.
Okay, well, we're going to agree to disagree. Let's move on to the next one.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.